we met, I think, was it just once? And something that came up was the word trauma as we were talking about this. And while you were all in the city, I was in the city, and then I went back to my parents' house in Long Island. And that immediately those sensory memories came back, and the sirens came up, and how that was in dead silence, we would hear sirens every now and then. I'm sure here you heard it a whole lot more than I did out there. And so with that understanding of trauma, I just want to touch on that really briefly, but understanding trauma not necessarily as something that's diagnosable. As we talk about trauma, it's not automatically post-traumatic stress disorder, which is oftentimes what we think about, but trauma as a wound. And there are factors that come into play to determine whether or not an event or an experience will wound us, right? If something that wounds me, the same experience might not have any effect on you. You might think about it next week and that would be it, but I might respond very differently. And we can think of that as like if we walked into, I don't want to use anything that can actually trigger anyone, but if, let's say we're walking along a pond, one summer night, you have a ton of bug spray on you. I have nothing. We can walk on the same path. You might be, and I have feelings about bug spray, but for all intents and purposes, you'll be fine, and I'll walk out of the same path with bug bites all over me, right? So what hurts me might not hurt you. It might not have the same effect on us. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But in psychology, we use the term often potentially traumatic event. So we won't say it's a traumatic event. It potentially will have a traumatic effect on someone. But we're not going to assume the impact on anyone. We also won't assume their level of resilience. So some unique aspects of COVID: anxiety, depression, PTSD, substance use, that went up. So if you weren't experiencing any of those symptoms before, and again, I'm not talking, even if you experience different symptoms of those diagnoses, you don't necessarily have anxiety or have depression or in a clinical way. But if you didn't experience any of those symptoms before, you might have started to. And you might have had difficulty sleeping. You might have been a bit more down. You might have had low energy. You might have been crying more. You might have felt a sense of hopelessness. And it's almost bizarre thinking back 2 years ago where we were, like what those feelings actually were. If you had symptoms of those conditions before, they might have worsened. Something that's very unique about COVID is that we went through it together. I know when it started for us, I immediately started thinking, when in recent history, have we all gone through something together? My mind went right to Magaya. At the time in Pirea during World War II. What was that like? I have no idea. All I know is that their community was together, and they were under occupation, and they snuck off into the hills with the young girls to pray, to teach them the hymns. They weren't allowed to go to church. There was so much that I was drawing as parallels, although I know that experience of her parents or grandparents was wildly different. It almost made us more human. It brought us together in this very strange way because we were all separate. It made us yearn for communion, the sacraments. When have we ever felt that way before? which in itself is pretty eye-opening. So we suffered together. Some suffered in heavier ways than others. Some suffered in different ways than others. And whether it was directly related to COVID or, on the periphery, how many medical appointments were put off? Like, how many people's anxiety, worries, their health concerns were raised because they had to put off a biopsy, right? Surgeries were delayed. We lost friends. I know in my community, there were a couple husband and wives who died, and we were never able to mourn them. And they were, prominent, they're so active in my church. And then we come back and they're gone. We couldn't come and truly engage in the rich traditions of our church during those times either. The hymnology of the funerals, how therapeutic those are, really therapeutic. The shared meals of the Macaria. There's a reason why we do these things. The community, the wisdom, and the timing of memorial services. Like in grief and bereavement, that first month and a half is so crucial. So much is experienced in that time. So we suffered together until we didn't, until things started dividing us. We watched the news a lot. We were watching numbers rise. We were watching certain politicians at noon every day to see what they had to say. And those numbers, we saw them rise. We saw them skyrocket. When in our history did we see that? It's never a good thing, right? It makes me think of 9/11, seeing those numbers, the counts rise, and how inhumane the count, those lives. It makes me think of during Vietnam, how they would list the names of the soldiers killed in action. Thank God the media at least learned that, not to do that. But we're glued to it. We're hanging on to the words of our politicians. And that brings us to this concept of moral injury. Moral injury is when we're betrayed by someone in authority. While we were hanging on to these words, we learned later they weren't all that accurate. If anyone works for the government and you're offended, I apologize. I too work for the government. But it's important thinking about our relationship to the news in this context and maybe expanding it to other experiences that we have. I work at the VA with veterans of all eras, with whether they're they experience combat or not. I met with a veteran recently who said, "I can't put my faith in the government anymore." And I said, "What? You put what in the government?" And it's something to consider, because where should our faith be? Where is my faith? He said that, and of course, I also, a side note, I don't speak to my veterans this way, as openly as I am with you. We're coming from this similar understanding within our church. So that question, as he tells me, I can't put my faith in the government, and he's my age, and I'm thinking, where am I putting my faith? Where are we putting our faith? What if we all put our faith in something much bigger than the government? What if we transcended that? What would our community look like? So think back to 2 years ago. It may not be pleasant, but what did you struggle with at that time? What was it like for you to wake up each day and not go out the front door? What was it like to not see your family members, to not come to church on Sunday mornings? What was it like to not have the freedom to just go to the grocery store and pick up a few avocados because you ran out? What was it like in the darkest time of the night when you couldn't sleep? With the clarity that you have now, what does that pain tell you about yourself? At the time, what did you need? What does that pain tell you about what's important to you? What do you truly value? And this reflection is so important. It's so important to look at difficult times in our life, as painful as it might be, because it's those times that give us a lot of clarity. Remember what it was like that first time you came back to church. That first time, if it's happened, that you received communion again. Probably isn't unusual that we were shaking. That was such a powerful moment. The first hug that you gave your grandkids or your siblings or your parents. So we had certain responses to the height of COVID, and even still now. And so a question is, when do those responses no longer serve their purpose? So I work with veterans, if that wasn't clear. When they experience PTSD symptoms, like, for example, hypervigilance, in combat, that's a good thing. You better be vigilant. You better be aware of what's going on around you. That's a matter of survival. But take that threat away, put them back at home, that hypervigilance becomes problematic. So when does quarantining become isolation? When does caution become anxiety? When does staying home become avoidance? And a really good excuse of it. I have a friend, she got married, I think, about 4 years ago. So more than half of her marriage has been during, COVID. And she has tremendous anxiety. And she told me COVID was such a relief because it gave me the perfect excuse to not leave my house. And her anxiety might have gone down, those symptoms, but she's having a real hard time now. So these unhelpful, and of course, there's a time and place for these things too. So again, thinking of when these things become problematic. So isolation, thinking about all the series and seasons of whatever on Netflix you watched. I know I did a whole lot. At the time, there was nothing else to do. So I was okay, are we still doing that? Might be problematic. The lack of air, the lack of movement, the lack of sunshine. Now we can do those things. You mentioned the alcohol consumption. These Zoom happy hours where we sat in our rooms by ourselves and a lot of people just drank alcohol with their friends. Was it healthy? Questionable. Are we still doing it? Maybe think about stopping that. But some helpful responses are that balance, the reflection, really reflecting. Sleep hygiene, Paulette mentioned sleep, and some things that we can do. Keeping a consistent wake-up time is so much more important than a consistent bedtime. I don't know, that was news to me when I heard that. In a type of therapy called DBT, which you mentioned, Christina, there's this thing called opposite action. right? And so thinking about what's important to us, right? When we were reflecting a few minutes ago, we had perhaps an idea of what's important to us. Things that go against our values, if there's an opportunity to go against our values in that in some way, and there's an urge to do that, think of opposite action. Like sometimes we need to do the exact opposite of what we're feeling compelled to do. Something else is normalizing our struggles. And I don't think this is necessarily COVID specific. Actually, a lot of this isn't COVID specific. Sorry, Zoe. But normalizing our struggles, being real with people, being authentic, asking people how you're doing, and really mean it. I have worked with people who have told me about their faith experiences, their experiences growing up in whatever religious tradition or faith tradition. And one of my early clients, it's always stuck with me, how she told me she stopped going to church when she was diagnosed with cancer because church was a place for happy people. I'm sorry. That was news to me. That was very different. That was very different than my experience. But thinking about our rich tradition, our faith does not expect us to be happy. Listen to Plagal Fourth. We are not expected to be happy. Right, is that the one I'm thinking? Plagal Second. Plagal Fourth is also a little. It's a little. But welcoming all of the emotions, we are here, and that's what the Psalms are. Welcoming the entire human experience. The Israelites crying out to God in utter despair, but crying out to God was the hopefulness that they needed. That's what got them through it. So something that we don't talk about too often is post-traumatic growth. So post-traumatic growth, with it, we function even better than we did prior to that potentially traumatic event. Post-traumatic growth leads to greater appreciation of life, improved relationships with others, a better sense of personal strengths, recognition of new possibilities, and my favorite, spiritual development. And most people respond to a potentially traumatic event with resilience. There's a range of what different studies say, but they say that 35 to 65% of people respond with resilience. Yet we focus on the non-resilient response a whole lot, which is usually about 5 to 10% of the population. So some of those factors that come into play when we are experiencing a potentially traumatic event that protect us, these protective factors include connection to others, our family and friends, helpful coping, not avoiding our thoughts, our feelings, our ability to find meaning in our suffering, believing that we have the ability to respond in the way that we need to. And a hugely significant factor, a protective factor, is faith, actively engaging in our faith. So I would like to touch on two stories that you already know. When I say the story of the paralytic, what do you think of?
A man whose friends carried him to Jesus and then opened up the roof to get him to
Yes.
Jesus.
Wonderful. So you think of one paralytic man. You think of the one whose friends were carrying him. His friends carried him. Christ was speaking to a group of people. His friends wanted him to be healed. They had faith that Christ would heal him. So they carry him to Christ. They can't get to him, so instead they remove the roof. What determination. They remove the roof, lower the man, and Christ says, because of your friend's faith, your sins are forgiven. So that's one paralytic man. There's another paralytic man at the pool. We'll have a nice reminder this Sunday. So there's the other paralytic man. He's been on his bed for 38 years. And Christ comes to him and says, do you want to be healed? And the man's response is, I have no one to help me. He needed to get into the pool in order to be healed. He could not do that by himself, and he could not do it quick enough. So Christ says, rise, take up your bed, and walk. And the man is healed. So taking note, there are two paralytic men. They have similar experiences, but very different circumstances. They have very different social networks. One is surrounded by friends, one has no one. And one has a tremendous desire to be healed, to get better. The other has access to all the resources that he needs. And the one thing that really unites them is Christ. And when we go through difficult things, keeping in mind there are two paralytic men can be really helpful. And we can get caught up in the why. Why is this happening? Why did this happen to me? Why did this happen to my friend? But I caution us not to. It's really hard to figure out why things happen. So asking that, there's a story in the Gospel of John. And there's a blind man. He's been blind from birth. And the disciples ask Christ, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents? Because he was born blind, so clearly someone had to have sinned. And Christ says, neither this man nor his parents. But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. This man was born blind. It was because of nobody's sin, but so that the works of God might be displayed in him. In our suffering, I don't read this to you lightly. This is not easy to digest, especially maybe here right now it is, but when we are suffering because something will come up in life again, will we remember this? This happened so that the works of God might be displayed in you. And so thinking about COVID, thinking about the difficulties we've gone through, it reveals so much about us. It reveals so much about the state of our heart, our community. And still, moving forward, how can we display the works of God? Thank you.